I am the chess strategist, and today we're going to win another chess game. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of our Rapid Speedrun. In yesterday's episode, we got the black pieces, and we played an interesting game in the Caro Kann defense, where we played defensive chess and got a solid position, and our opponent felt pressured to make something happen, and they decided to go for a tactic that didn't work, and we got a very quick win with a resignation. So today we are going to maybe get a repeat of the Caro Kann. Maybe I'll show you another opening. If we get white pieces, we are going to be playing a different move other than e4. So I would like to see what we're going to end up getting. So let's just get it right into it. Okay, and we get the black pieces, and our opponent's open with e4. Now, there's a few different moves we could go for here. I know I said I would play the Caro Kann, but you know what? I think I want to go for the more principled, solid response that we've seen a lot of our opponents go for, and I want to tell you guys how to play it. That is e5 on move 1. So your opponent plays e4, and you play e5, the solid response, which is very symmetrical, and gets into nice, interesting positions. Okay, so our opponent goes for knight f3, and we're going to go with the principled response, knight c6, defending the pawn in the center of the board. And our opponent plays what's called the Scotch Game. And the Scotch Game is playing d4 in this move. And putting a second pawn in the center is nice because it opens up your pieces for development quicker. And you do get an extra pawn in the center of the board. So we don't want to allow him to take, so we always take here. And he takes. And we're going to play a variation in the Scotch Game that involves us developing our knights. So we're going to develop our knight. Our opponent is going to take. And there is a few different ways to take. One of them is taking with the b pawn and then the d pawn. Now, if we take with the d pawn, what it does allow is our opponent to trade queens favorably and restrict us from castling for the rest of the game. So what we want to do is we want to play this move, b takes c6. And we want to free up this diagonal for our bishop eventually. And also we're preparing to move d5. And I think d5 is a nice move to play here. We could also just develop our bishop. That's also an idea that we can do. Trade off the bishop pair. I'm thinking about this. If we go d5 here, our opponent may respond with e5. But if we do have that, we can deal with it. We want to have this pawn in the center of the board controlling and countering his e4 pawn, which is hard to defend, to be honest. He could play f3, but that's a move that we want to induce from him. Okay, cool. And he's decided to play the move knight c3, which can be countered in a few different ways. Now, I like this move. I like seeing this move at least because it allows us to advance our pawn further, even to d4, knocking away his knight, most likely to e2, or it could go back to its original square. But it's not going to go advance to these squares because this pawn is nicely covering those squares. So I'm starting to like the idea of advancing again. The other reason I like advancing is because now if we advance our pawn and our opponent decides to strike with e5, we are going to have this d5 square for our knight, which is an excellent square. So I'm thinking advancing again is probably our best move here. And we're going to go for it very quickly. I suspect this move is probably going to come. He's going to want to create pressure on this pawn. And we're going to be able to support this pawn with our c6 pawn, which may become the c5 pawn if we play it. Okay, and our opponent has decided to put his knight on the side of the board here, which I don't think is too wise of an option. Feels like the knight is kind of stranded on this side of the board, and we might be able to win it through some tactics eventually. But before we do any of that, I want to try to win some material and also develop our pieces. I want to get a rook to the e1 or e8 square as soon as possible. Also, our rook can be developed to this open file at any moment, which would be an interesting thing to do. Let's see. I like this move as well. It does meet with this response, which I don't think is that bad. You're not really in a position to exploit the the weakness of the f2 square in this diagonal. We're not really in the position to do that, so I don't think it's too big of a deal to encourage that move, f3. Although it can be annoying. Just because we can encourage him to make a weakening move doesn't mean we have to. Doesn't mean it's the best move. Here I really don't think it is. Where does this bishop want to go? I like e7 a little bit. I like d6. The only thing is it restricts the control of this. But we have this pawn move always. Let's just go here. I want to restrict the advance of this pawn. I also want to restrict him from developing his bishop like this. Now notice that him developing his dark square bishop, we can counter that move with rook to b8, or we can play it preemptively and make sure that he can't move his bishop or his knight. Now his knight is defending the square for now, but in time that's not going to be the case. Okay, and we just castle, and our opponent is looking to play this move pretty soon. That's the move he wants to play. That's his idea. And it's a pretty solid idea. But let's see. What can we do here? We have to move one of these pieces. We can also consider throwing in this move now. Now that the bishop is not going to be knocked away by this move, we gain a tempo. You can just drop our bishop back to e7. And if he advances his pawn here, he will be forfeiting this square permanently. Notice that if he was to play this move, c4, we would have en passant in most scenarios. And here we can play bishop over. Just win a tempo against his queen. And here we want to drop our bishop back and reroute it. Alright, so now that he's committed his pawn structure, he's really weakening himself here. Alright, so I was seeing rook e1 or rook e8 as the move here, and then followed up by bishop to d6. Of course, the idea is if we play bishop d6 immediately, he can fork us, but if we play rook first, we're going to have an extra control over this square. and then the threat will come with a lot more. Okay, so our opponent is attacking this square twice, and we have to defend it with bishop f8. Notice now we're revealing the attack on this pawn. So we're attacking and defending. And that was a very powerful move. Our opponent might not see the secondary threat. Our opponent does see the secondary threat, though. Now he's noticed this bishop is occupied. He's decided to jump his knight onto a square where it could not previously access. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to drop our king over, renewing the threat of bishop take, or pawn takes bishop here. And I think his pieces are in very vulnerably placed positions. His bishop is hanging and his knight is hanging. And the whole reason that his bishop was able to stay like this is because of the pin. And the whole reason his knight's able to stay like this is because the bishop is stuck. So if this bishop moves from the square, we could take the knight. If the knight moves on this turn, then we can take the bishop. So it looks like we're winning a piece here because our opponent has failed to realize that we can deal with his threats with a single move. The single move king to h8 unpins the pawn and renews this threat. So we've gone from a position where, on the last move, where he was unable, or we were unable to take either piece because of threats. If we take here, he has checkmate. And if we take, we can't take here at all. And because of the pin. But now we step over, and now there's two threats, and he's decided he has to move his knight. He's going to make sure that his knight moves out of the way. And yeah, with that, it looks like we are going to be able to win this bishop. And of course, we're not completely out of the woods yet. We have to be very careful. But him having a no dark square bishop is going to be a nice asset for us. Also, notice that his knight is really out of squares. Dropping our queen over can be interesting. Here, one idea he has is to attack both of our rooks. But we're going to be able to win a tempo here on the queen. With this knight move. Then we can capture here, creating a double threat against the queen and the knight. And here it looks to me like we're going to emerge up a piece. We're going to take his knight, he's going to take our bishop, and we're going to take. And he may be able to take our pawn here, but we're going to emerge up a piece. Notice how our queen is covering this key square here, covering the checks. So he's going to take, we're going to take. Notice we have this extra bishop that's going to be eyeing the king. We're going to be able to attack. He might take this pawn. He's going to have this nice pass pawn. But we have our king right close to the pass pawn, which is always nice. We have an extra piece also. So our attack is going to be much stronger. He decides to take this pawn, which I think is the less valuable of the pawns that he could have taken. And here I see the opportunity to go for a fork that forces a trade of queens. So what we can do here is go for this move, where what we do is put the queen on a defended square, where we're attacking the pawn, and the queen's defense is obstructed by the other queen. So we might be able to just trade the queens off here, get ourselves into a favorable endgame, where we're up a full piece for a pawn. And when you have a material advantage, you should always be looking for opportunities to trade. Here I just saw this because I noticed that our bishop is eyeing this square. Our queen would love to go and attack that square, and since this queen is defending, it's the only defender, she has to either trade or give up the pawn. And giving up the pawn isn't checkmate immediately, but it's very close. It's going to force the king out into that square. So our opponent decides that it's not worth it, and he trades the queens. And we're still creating an attack on this pawn that he has to defend. Most likely he's going to be playing this move or this move. Okay, and he's decided that he wants to advance his pawn, which is fine with us. We are going to move our rooks to open files. What's the open file? Well, the main open file is this E file. So we're going to play along the open E file. We're going to put our rook there. Keep him from putting a rook there. We're going to double up on the E file, and we're going to invade as well. One concept in endgames that's important is rooks on the 7th rank. You want your rooks to be on the 7th rank because they control... First of all, there's a lot of pawns on the 7th rank, so a lot of material you can always win. And the best way to guarantee that you can get a rook on the 7th rank is by doubling your rooks and then invading through the square. So here the square is E2. And we are threatening on the next move to invade with our rook. So our opponent will probably have to scoot his king over. Now our opponent has decided to put his rook and double up on their own file that's closed. Now if our opponent was to have taken the pawn here with the queen, he would have had a pass pawn on this square, which would have been a really nice pass pawn to have. And it would have created a lot of pressure for him. But here, he doesn't have a pass pawn, and he's not really creating much in the way of pressure towards us. So we're not scared, really, at all. Like, we have a lot of strengths in this position. Our opponent is going to have to do a lot to create a pass pawn, and I'm not too worried. Here his plan might be to advance and create a pass pawn, but we can deny him the creation of pass pawn because we do have 2 pawns covering this key break square. One thing we can do, though, is create our own pass pawn. How? Well, we want to create it on this square. We want to get a pawn defending this pawn advance. So we're going to try to advance our C pawn. That's the plan. So we're going to advance our C pawn to C5. Then we're going to go to C4, and then we're going to play D3. And what that'll do is create a pass pawn on this square. They're going to trade pawns. We'll have a pawn here, and we can keep advancing this pawn. And our opponent's going to have to deal with that. The other thing we can start to do is once we get these pawns advanced, we can develop this bishop to this diagonal. It's done its job attacking this pawn. Now, this pawn is weak, but if this rook never moves, it's not going to be weak. We can redeploy the bishop to this diagonal where it's penetrating and pinning the rook and creating a lot of pressure. So we're seeing here that the strength of the position is this extra bishop. The extra bishop is making the difference. And our opponent is going to have a very difficult time dealing with it. Here he's going to try to create a pass pawn. We're going to be faster though. Our pawns are pushing up the board much quicker than his. And once we vacate this diagonal, we're going to have this diagonal to use as well. Even if he does get a pass pawn, we have a rook defending, and we have a king here too. So we're going to create our pass pawn. Notice that if you pin this rook is just useless. It's not doing anything but sitting behind a pinned rook. And here our opponent makes it even easier for us by taking. Now, we can take a few different ways here. What's the best way to take? Well, we can take with the pawn, getting a tempo on the rook. The rook's going to have to go here. Then what we could do is develop our bishop to that square, attacking the rook and controlling the square again. So we're going to do that because it's just the best move. Attack the rook. The rook has to go here. Then we develop our bishop, attacking the square. And our opponent decides that he just gives up the rook for the pawn. We take again, and it's going to be a quick mop up from here. We've won too much material for our opponent, and he resigns. Okay, let's just do a quick analysis here. So we had the Scotch game, and we played what's called the Schmidt variation. Now, I know I don't usually play e5, but I'm just going to get very into this. There's a few different things your opponent can play when they go knight f3. On this turn, there's a few different ideas. There's, first of all, the 2 knights, or ends up being the 4 knights very quickly. That's one thing they can go for. They can go for the Ponziani, which is c3. They can go for the Scotch, which is d4 immediately. They can also go for the Italian, which we've played many times, and the Roy Lopez, which we played the other day. So those are the main openings you're going to face when you get knight f3 and knight c6. But here we got the Scotch. There's a few different ways to respond, but all of them start with taking. Your opponent takes back, and you can play bishop c5, which is the classical variation. People play this all the time. And there's also this move I like to play, knight f6, the Schmidt variation. And the Schmidt variation is very theoretical, very interesting variation. A lot of time you end up taking with the b pawn, and you develop your bishop to a6 a lot of times. And you play d5, and you get a very interesting double-edged position. I really like what we got here. We take. Our opponent puts his bishop on d3, which is not the most common move. There's many other ways to play this. Usually they involve playing e5 at some point, and the knight jumps to the center of the board. But here our opponent decided he wasn't going to do that. Also, queen e2 is a move that's played a lot in these positions. It wasn't played. And we end up getting to advance our pawn all the way to e4. And let's see what the engine thinks. Engine actually really likes white here because of this move, knight to e2. Knight a4 is also good. And we decided to advance our bishop to d6, which I think was a bad placement. I feel like it creates this idea of f4 that I wasn't super keen on when I saw him play it. So I should have just played bishop e7. That would have been a better move. Bishop e4 would have been better according to the computer. But anyways. Bishop d3, castles, opponent plays f4, and we kind of have to do something else with our bishop because our bishop is going to be forked if we don't move it. Of course, when opponent plays f4, they're threatening this move e5, which is going to win one of our pieces, so we can't let them do that. We drop back our bishop, and here we decide to develop our bishop and drop it back. The idea is we want to reroute it here and force him to commit these pawns. Now notice these pawns, they can play e5 or they can play f5. Either one can be strong. If we move our bishop here and we play f5, well, this bishop might get stranded. So we want to encourage him to play one of those moves so that the pawn structure is committed. We want the pawns to be committed, and when they're committed, they're not mobile, it's easier to attack. So when he plays f5, it's really easy to attack this pawn. When he plays e5, it's easier to attack this pawn because you can't really advance again. If you advance again, you're going to create even more weaknesses. So he advances f5, and we decide we want to attack this pawn. So we drop our rook over, playing to play d3, and he could have gone with this e5 move, knocking our knight away, but he decided that he was going to go for the immediate attack on our pawn, creating a checkmate threat. We found one of the few moves. Apparently this move, knight g4, would have been even better. But knight g4 to me looked like it was going to run into this move. But since it does attack the bishop, you're actually chilling. So I didn't consider that as a nice move. We played bishop f8, which does the job. And our opponent developed his knight to this square. And wow, there's a few different moves here. One of them being queen d6, which gives an advantage immediately, which is just kind of like a fork. If our opponent, we're forking the knight and the queen. If our opponent takes the queen, we take, or even take with the pawn, and the knight is hanging, the bishop is also hanging, and we're up a piece. But we played a different move that also equalizes king h8. And bishop g5 would have been the best try. But our opponent went for knight a6. Interesting. We played g takes h, and our opponent took. We played bishop d6, or sorry, we played knight takes e4 first, which isn't as good as bishop d6 immediately, but it's still good. -4, so it's still really good for us. And then we play bishop d6. Opponent drops his queen over. We take the knight. Then we take, he takes the bishop, and we take his bishop. And now he could have taken on f7, which I thought was the best move, but he decided to take this pawn, and that allows us to go for a queen trade immediately. Or we could have lifted our rook over as well, which would have been even more devastating. I should have seen that. Rook over. But we decided to put our queen over, and we trade into an endgame, and it's not an equal endgame. It's a completely winning endgame where we've got an extra bishop. We're able to use that bishop to create a lot of pressure. We create a passed pawn, and our opponent cracks by taking immediately. I think he should have just traded. This passed pawn is not going anywhere because we don't have any control of this square yet. So I don't think the passed pawn was that dangerous. By him taking, he allows us to put the passed pawn closer to promotion and on a square defended by our rook. So this is just doomed. You know, in practice, the evaluation hasn't gotten much worse, but it is really worse because we get to play this move, and then he's forced to take, and now we're just up a piece, and he resigns, and there's not much to do. So this was a game about defending, fighting precise moves, and understanding the temporary temporary invincibility of pieces, and understanding what moves you can make to make the pieces vulnerable again. So we understood that we could not take this knight because of checkmate. We also understood that this bishop is not allowed to be taken by rule because of the pin. So we think of moves that, first of all, make it so there's not a checkmate threat, or that they allow us to take. And we see king h8. We see that we're allowed to take. This bishop has to move. If this bishop moves, there's no more checkmate threat, and if there's no more checkmate threat, then boom, we can take this knight. So we're creating a lot of threats at once, and our opponent is going to have to find a very precise move in order to stay in the game when you make a move like that. And our opponent was just unable to find those moves, and we were able to win some material and got into a knight to endgame. And from there, it was just clean conversion. We focused on key endgame principles, which is keeping your pieces active. We noticed that this bishop wasn't going to be active. We noticed this is the diagonal we wanted to play it to, but our opponent panicked, and he allowed us to create a passed pawn, and we saw an even juicier diagonal. This one right here, attacking this rook, which eventually sacrificed itself. And here we end up getting the win because our opponent he just doesn't see a way forward in this position, and I don't either. This pawn is going to fall, or this one we're going to have another passed pawn. These pawns aren't going anywhere. Our king is here to defend. We're going to be fine. So computer says it's forced checkmate in 7 moves for black. Like white is going to be checkmate in 7 moves if black plays correctly. So I think it's definitely within the realm of resignation. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Of course, e5 is not the most exciting attacking opening, but I'm super excited in the next video to show you an awesome opening with white that you can use to attack your opponents. And I hope you guys enjoy this video. Have a good rest of your day.